okay, because we really didn't spend any time on it of any significance. So we're going to pick it up today and talk more about it. And there's a few things to consider with CSS. Because CSS is responsible for the appearance of the page. HTML is responsible for the content of the page. All right? And there are times when it can be a little confusing. Is that appearance, is it content? But for the most part, it's straightforward. You know, content is a paragraph, right? Appearance is, should that paragraph be in blue font or black font or red font? Or should it be in Times New Roman? Should it be in Helvetica? Should it be whatever? All right, that's appearance. It doesn't really change the content to change the appearance, but it might emphasize the content or sort of guide the user through the page. So a few things to think of, and I'm just going to list them out here as we talk about CSS. Number one, the appearance of your page depends on two things. Number one, the browser defaults. And number two, the CSS that you create. All right, so that's what your page appearance depends on. Because so far, we haven't done anything with CSS to speak of. Yet we still see our page, and it looks a certain way. All right. The reason it looks the way that it looks is because of the browser defaults. The reason that the pages that we've done so far have had white backgrounds and black font and probably Times New Roman font and so on is because those are the defaults built into the browser. So that's part of the appearance. So you get the default unless you change it. How do you change it? You change it via CSS. All right? So that's the first thing to remember. If you look at your page, it's like, why does it look that way? The answer is one of two things. Either it's the browser default or it's something you've done in your CSS. All right. Number two. Use CSS purposefully. What I mean by that is that, to be sure, we want our pages to look nice. That's an aspect of web design, right? It's to make the pages look aesthetically pleasing. So that is a purpose of using CSS, to make the appearance look nice. But that's not the sole purpose of it. One of the things that we do is we use CSS to emphasize or de-emphasize certain things, all right? To make things stand out, to give our users visual cues about how our page is structured, all right? So we do things to make things consistent. Let's say we're a pharmaceutical company, all right, and we have our warnings about side effects on our medicine, all right? We may choose to make those look a certain way. We may put a border around it. We may make it in bold font. We may make it in red font, for example. That will cause it to stand out from the normal text on the page. And we will gradually educate our users, if we're consistent, that if they see something that looks like that, that means something. All right? So what you don't want to do is just randomly apply CSS just because you can. You know? And therefore, use it in a purposeful way. Use it to emphasize stuff. Use it to help the user identify different stuff on your page. And do it in a consistent manner. So you're sort of educating your user visually about how your page is structured and what certain content of the page represents. So use it purposefully. It shouldn't be like we've learned how to make every single tag on the page look different, so we're going to put CSS to show off our mad CSS skills, right? We don't want to do that. We want to do it in a way that's purposeful. All right? Third thing, there are some HTML and attributes that allow you to change the appearance of content. Don't use them. So I'll put an X through that. Don't use them. What would an example of that be? A center tag. And if you don't know what these tags are, don't worry about it. All right? Good. Don't ever learn them. All right? But a center tag. You can put on the body of your page a background color attribute. Right on the body tag, you can put a background color attribute. These are all carryovers of the days when CSS wasn't fully yet adopted. So these are like old carryovers from the past. All right? Back when CSS wasn't really as powerful and as functional as it is now. So there's some of these things still exist in HTML, but avoid using them. All right? A break tag, a BR tag is another example of that. All right? These are tags that only talk about the appearance of the page. All right? And therefore you shouldn't use them. There is nearly always a CSS way that's better. And why is it better? It's better because it's more flexible. Sort of our end game here, and we're not going to get to that, we might get to that later today, or we might get to it on Wednesday, is we're going to create a common file for our CSS. So we're going to put all our CSS in one place, in one file. And all the pages on our site are going to share that file. Well, guess what? That's great. That gives a consistent look to the site. All right? And if we want to change something about the site, all we have to do is change it in one place, in the CSS. And it will change the appearance of every single page. I worked ages ago. I worked on a website for K Jewelers. All right? Now, K Jewelers, as you know, a lot of jewelry sales is seasonal, right? Valentine's Day sales, Christmas holiday sales, Mother's Day, that sort of thing. All right? So they would want their page to sort of be themed based on the time of year it was. Maybe Valentine's Day it was pinkish, most of it. Maybe for Christmas it was red and green, and so on down the line. All right? So we had dozens, probably hundreds of pages on the site. All right? But because the CSS was put in one place to change the theme of the page, let's say from Christmas to Valentine's Day, all we would do is go into the CSS file and say, well, instead of making this pink, make it green, and make it blue, make this red, and whatever. And we would have a totally different looking site, even though we really didn't do a lot of work. All right? So by just changing the common code, the common CSS file that all your pages are going to share, you can change the site drastically. All right? When I talk about the appearance, I'm talking about everything about the appearance. In other words, the positioning, the fonts, the colors, the size, all those things come into CSS. We're going to start out simple by doing colors, because unless you're colorblind, colors are the most obvious thing to see. I can demonstrate that very easily, and we can talk about our pages and making the changes. So we'll start out talking about colors, and gradually as we go on, we'll add more things to it. The next thing we might talk about might be fonts, and then we will talk about sizes of things, and so on and so forth. So we'll sort of sprinkle this in. So really, for most of the rest of the semester, we're going to be doing a little bit of HTML, a little bit of CSS, and sort of sprinkling things in back and forth. All right? I think that's all as far as introductory stuff goes. Let's go and look at the example that we had last time. We had this page. All right, well, we didn't get too far with it. But we were able to change a couple things about the appearance. Keep in mind that sometimes when I demonstrate, I'll do things that look obvious. I'm not necessarily going for a extremely attractive looking web page. All right? So in other words, this is just an example. This isn't meant to, I'm not holding this up as an example of stupendous web design. This is simply an example of technically how you go and change the color of things at the page. Again, that's the two parts of web development. It's the technical aspect of like how you do something, and then the design aspect of what really makes sense to do in this context. What should we be doing? All right? That goes along with what I said about using CSS purposefully. At any rate, let's look at the code for this. First of all, notice that our style code is in the head section. We have a style tag that tells the browser we're speaking another language here. That tells the browser between the start and end tag, between the start and end style tag, that is not HTML code, that this is CSS code. This is sort of a side question here. What do you think would happen if I forgot the end style tag? Yes? The colors would be gone. Do we have any other answer? You're right, but you're incomplete. Yes? Everything would be gone, right? So not just the colors, but everything. And let's look and make sure that I'm not lying here. Actually, the colors stayed. I was mistaken. But all the content's gone. Why is that? Well, again, let's look at it. We said we're in CSS land. So the browser understands, and I should have thought of this, but the browser understands that, okay, this is CSS code, this is CSS code. We've never told it when we're out of CSS land, though. All right? So therefore, it interprets the rest of the page as CSS. And there's no content then on the page. And of course, this is not legal CSS code, so it doesn't really do anything with it. It gets an error. So, but it does the part of the page that it does understand. So we get that. All right, interesting. All right, let's put it back to where it was. And let's review what good CSS code looks like. All right, first of all, CSS consists of a series of rules. All right? And the rules look like this. I'm going to write what, like, sometimes in the textbook they say is like the general form of a rule. All right? The basic structure of what a rule looks like. A CSS rule looks like this. We have something that's called a selector. We have these, I think the right word is braces. Sometimes I'll call them curly brackets, but those things. All right? We then will have an attribute name, a colon, a value, a semicolon, and more of these. So this we can repeat for different attributes. All right? So the first thing is called the selector. Then inside the braces, there are pairs of attribute, colon, value, semicolon. What's an attribute? Again, it's similar to what we talked about in HTML. An attribute is a characteristic, additional information about it. So let's look at our CSS code and see how it fits this format. We have something called body. One of our CSS rules says body, brace, and background yellow. All right. This is a selector. What does a selector do? It says what on the page does this style rule apply to. And the simplest selector that you can have, there's different sorts of selectors, but the simplest selector is an HTML tag. So this will apply to every HTML tag that is named body. Every body tag in our page. Well, right, there's only going to be one of them, but the CSS will apply to every body tag on our page. All right, so that's the selector. Let's look at our other CSS rule. Header, background, white. All right. I'm catching myself. I'm doing better. All right. Again, this is a selector. What on the page gets this? Well, what gets it is everything in our header tag or tags, right? Because there could be more than one header tag potentially. It probably won't be, but there could be. So that's what gets the style rule. So what is the style rule then? Well, again, we could have attribute value and we could repeat it, but we don't repeat it. We just have one. First thing is the name of the attribute, background. And what does background represent? It represents the background color of that tag on the page. What value? Well, for the body, the background is yellow. For the header, the background is white. Okay? So the selector says what gets that rule. The attribute then is the thing of the page that we want to change, colon, the value is what we want to change it to. All right? Simple enough. There's a whole list of attributes that we can change. Far more than you could possibly memorize. Now, typically the rule is you'll remember, eventually you'll remember the ones that you change all the time. And then you might have to look some up from time to time, right? That's how it works for me. The CSS code that I write all the time, I just know off the top of my head. But if there's something that I haven't done too often, I might have to look it up. All right? And that's okay. You don't have to have everything memorized. So we're going to go over a couple of these today, and we're going to deal mainly with colors. Now, we could add another part of the CSS rule to say this. I told you it's not going to necessarily be a pretty page. All right? Color red. Background relates to the background color of the page. Color relates to the color of the font. Sometimes people find it easier to do this with their CSS. All right? That way they can see that this is one attribute and value, this is the next attribute and value, and so on down the line. CSS is kind of like HTML, like you can format it the way that you think is easier to read. So if I do that then almost everything on the page is red font. What isn't red font? Links. Why not? Because the browsers have defaults for links. So unless we change them, we get the browser defaults. All right? Now let's make sure we understand how this works. I've said everything in the body gets this rule. Everything in the body. And what's everything in the body? Well, it's all the content, right? Because all of our content is between the start and end body tag. So everything in the body gets this style rule. The background's going to be yellow, and the color is going to be red. I have a second style rule that says headers, I want the background to be white. Now a header, the header is contained in the body tag, right? It's nested inside the body tag. So this is part of the cascading part of cascading style rules. If I define a rule for a tag that contains other tags, then all the tags inside it get that rule too, unless we overrule that rule. All right? It's actually simpler than what I just said. All right? I just said it and that sounded confusing even to me. All right? So let's go back and look at this. Everything in the body gets this rule. So everything in the body is yellow and has a text color of red. The header, however, I said, well, the header is, I want the background color to be white. So because the header is inside of the body, first the browser applies the body style rule to it, then it applies the header style rule to it. So the end result will be the background of the header will be white. All right? So we could have one rule that sort of overrules the other rule. All right? In this case, the rule for the header takes precedence over the rule for the body, because the rule for the body is the general rule for the whole page, and the rule for the header is specifically for that header. So the rule written specifically for the header overrules the general rule for the body. Yes?
So does that mean that the order of which you put in the rules for your style, does that have any effect or not really?
Not really. All right, so I could switch this, for example. It's dependent on the nesting and how specific. The way that I've heard it said sometimes is like the closer you define a rule to a piece of content, that takes precedence over the further away. So in other words, yes, the header's in the body, but the header is the header, right? So a rule that we apply specifically to the header gets precedence over a rule that we apply to the body tag, which contains the header. All right? So the more specific we point to something, the more that takes precedence over a more general rule. A more specific rule takes precedence over that. And it doesn't really depend on the order. There are a handful of cases where the order does matter, but we'll not in cases like this. So we'll not worry about those now. Now notice one thing though. What is the color of the text in the header? Well, so let's look to remind you. It's red. All right? So really, two style rules apply to the header. The header style rule and the body style rule. Why does the body style rule also apply to the header? Well, because the header is inside the body. All right? So, where those two style rules have something in common, that is, both of them have a background, the more specific one takes precedence. So the background of this is going to be white. Notice there is no color for the header, though. So that style rule sort of cascades from the body down to the header. So I can overrule part of a style rule, which is exactly what I did here. The header, I've changed the background from the basic style rule of the body, but I haven't changed the color, and therefore I get the body's color. Now let's go and do this. And I'm going to change this to look like this. All right. Let's think of how this page is going to look. I have a style rule for the body. All right? So that's going to apply to everything on the page at first. So the whole body I've defined is going to have a background of yellow and a color of red. The header part, I overrule part of the style rule. And I say the background is white. So this code will have a white background. The H1, I've said the color is blue. All right? So therefore, this overrules the body's color of red, because the H1 style rule is more specific to this code than the body style rule is. So when I refresh the page, when I save and refresh the page is going to be yellow. The background of the header is going to be white, and this is going to be blue, because I've defined a style rule for the H1 to say the color is blue. And there we go. This is one of those things that is good to play with. All right? You can listen to what I say and you can sort of understand what I'm saying. But when you play with it and say, what if I change this? What if I change that? And see the results, then it should be obvious. It should make it more clear. And you can certainly ask any questions. But how specific you define the rule matters. So in this case, the H1 rule is specific to this tag. It's right on that tag, that H1 rule. So it takes precedence over the rule for the header. The header rule for this content takes precedence over the rule for the body, and so on. So the more specific, the closer that rule is to the HTML tag, that takes precedence. Questions? All right. Let's see what is next. Colors. I'm using basic colors because, you know, I can remember yellow and red, white and blue. All right? However, what colors can you use? Well, if you Google HTML color names, you'll see a whole list of them. We can make our page bisque if we want. And there's a nice bisque. I don't know what that means, but it is that color, all right? Isn't bisque a kind of soup? Okay. So if you were doing a web page about soups, you could make it bisque. Blanched almond. Now, I'm sitting here like an inch from there, and I can barely tell the difference between blanched almond and bisque, but apparently there is a difference, all right? Blue, blue-violet, brown, burly wood, cadet blue, chartreuse, and so on. There's a whole bunch of them, all right? Whole bunch of colors that you can use, all right? Yes?
If you're using a hex code instead of the color name, just, you know.
Right.
How would you apply that? Would you apply the number symbol? Or
Yeah. In other words, let's say I happen to say this is the color that I want, and I don't know that it's called bisque. All right. There's another way. There's actually two other ways you can specify colors. You can give the color name if you happen to know it. All right. And if you don't know, just look it up on the chart. All right. The other way is through what's called a hex code. And we'll talk about how these are constructed in a minute. All right. And the hex code, you can go and you simply put it in instead of the color name. So instead of saying background bisque, you could say background $FFE4C4. All right. And the result will be the same. So that's the second way to specify colors. So there's a lot of different color names, but really there are like millions of colors that you can have on the computer, right? And there's only maybe a couple hundred of these color names. Well, what if you want a color or you want a particular shade that isn't represented by one of these names? Or as was stated, well, if you don't know the name, you figured out the color that you want through a variety of different other possible methods, but you don't know the name of it. Well, there's two other ways that you could represent colors. One is through what's called a hex code, which we just saw. And we'll talk about that in a minute. What I want to talk about first, though, is the RGB method. RGB stands for red, green, and blue. All right? If you take a physics class and you talk about light, any color can be represented through different shades of red, green, and blue. All right? If any of you remember the old projection big screen TVs back in the old days, they would actually have three lenses if you looked at them. There'd be a red, a green, and a blue. And again, they weren't the best TVs, but you could get colors, different colors, by simply combining different shades of red, green, and blue. So, for example, if I have a lot of red and a lot of blue, the color is going to be what? It's going to be purple. All right? If I have, and no green. All right? If I have a lot of red, no green, and a little bit of blue, it's going to be a reddish purple. If I switch those around and have a little bit of red, no green, and a lot of blue, it's going to be a bluish sort of purple. All right? So I can mix these colors, similar like what they do at a paint store or if, you know, whatever, where you mix different colors together and you get the color that you want. If I mix all of them all the way, I'm going to have white. If I have none of any of them, I'm going to get black. All right? So, with the RGB syntax, you specify a number from 0 to 255. So, 255, 0, 255 will be purple. So let's go and put that in here. Background, RGB. Yeah. 255, 0, 255. Saying red, green, and blue. RGB, say it's that order. All right. So a lot of red, because 255 is the highest number that you can get in this particular, that's as high as it goes. That's all the way up, all right? 0 is all the way off. So a lot, you know, as much red as possible, 0 green, and as much blue as possible is going to give us a purple. All right? So that's the shade of purple. If we go and turn this down, make it a smaller number. So let's make this one, let's make it 200. It's more of a bluish sort of purple. And we can take it down even further. and it's more bluish still. If we took it all the way down to 0, then it would be purely blue. All right, we could go the other direction too. We could keep the red constant and lower the blue and get a reddish shade of purple. All right. Gray. Gray is where all three of the numbers are equal. So 200, 200, 200 would be gray. If I lower those numbers, it's going to be a darker shade of gray. If I turn them all to 0, it's going to be actually black. If I turn them all the way up to 255, it will be white. All right. So that's the second way that we can do colors. The third way is through what's called hex code or hexadecimal code. Hexadecimal code is really a lot like this. With hexadecimal code, hexadecimal means base 16, right? Our basic number system is base 10, right? The normal number system that we use day to day. Because we have 10 digits. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 10 digits, base 10. So the first, the rightmost digit is the ones. Next to that is the tens, hundreds, thousands, and so on. All right? With hexadecimal, you have a base 16. So with hexadecimal, you turn these 3 numbers into 3 pairs of hex digits. This being the ones column, this being the 16s column. The digits in hexadecimal 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Then E, C, D, E, and F. So F corresponds to decimal 15. So F in the 16s column means 15 16s, which is 0, 3, 80, 1, 6, 240, plus 15 in the ones is 255. So FF equals 255. 0, 0 equals 0, 0. If you didn't understand a word of what I said, don't worry about it, because you can look them up. The chart will tell you what it is. I just provide this information just so that it's not a total mystery of how it works. Hexadecimal numbers, again, correspond to these 0 through 255s, is sort of the simple. And you can even use a hex calculator. A lot of online calculators or built in the computer have a hex conversion feature if you're not sure of how it goes. So, if we look at this, again, just was as stated. If we want slate blue, this is the hex code. Let's do slate gray. That's 708090 in hex. So if you don't know what it is, you can look it up, and it'll give you that that's slate gray. If you're interested, 708090 would be 7 times 15, which is 2, 4, 112, 128, 144. So just for laughs, I'm going to make this one, I'm going to use RGB. I'm going to put in 112, 128, 144. And then for this one, I'm going to put slate gray. And all three of those have the same background. All right? It's just three different ways of expressing the same number. It's great if you understand how the RGB and how the hex code works. If you don't understand, you can just copy and paste. All right? That's sort of the good news for this. Now, we've learned how to change colors. All right? That's the good news. The bad news is it's not necessarily easy to come up with color combinations that really look good, right? I mean, some people have more of a sense of that than other people do, all right? Fortunately, there's some science involved in it, right? There's some science about what our eyes find aesthetically pleasing. And we can use that to use some color scheme generators that uses the rules of optics and all that to come up with some color schemes that look at least pretty good. All right? It's good to use these if you don't feel yourself have a good skills for determining good colors that go together. Now, one thing that I've said before is I talked about using CSS purposefully. That doesn't mean, in fact, it means the opposite of having like everything on the page a different color. If everything on a page is a different color, then that's chaos for the user. They can't tell what is what. They can't get any sort of, their eyes are not directed in a particular way, all right? Because everything's a different color. Therefore, restraint is good. So you use a few colors. You don't use 100 colors. You use maybe 3 or 4 colors. Always remembering that you can kind of add white, black, and gray in, and that doesn't really count, right? Because those are neutral, especially white and black, right? So it doesn't really matter what your color scheme is. If you have something white or if you have something black, it's not gonna look horrible. All right. So let's look for a color scheme generator. And there's one I use a lot. Is it this one? I think it is. Which oddly enough is not a really, I don't like the very low contrast of it. Notice how the text is very low contrast, but I do like the results it gives. So I suffer through the design. Let's say I have a page that I want the main theme to be green. You know, I'm working for an environmental company, right? So I want to brand my website. So yeah, we'll just make it green. I can turn this color wheel around, and I get different shades of green that go together. So I can click on, what is it? I can click on I can copy either the RGB. I think I can copy it. I'm not seeing how I do that, but I'll just remember it. C7E99B. I could go here and make C7E99B. And I can do that even if I don't know what those numbers mean, right? It's just a code. Really doesn't matter if it's upper or lowercase either, by the way. So now if I look at it, that will be my main background for the page. I can then pick a contrasting color that is going to at least go pretty well with it. So let's close it and let's go with this. That's 2C4E00. All right, maybe that doesn't look good. That's a little too dark. Let's switch these around. Let's put this on the header. And let's give a color of white so that the text is a white color. Notice that the CSS code didn't work, so I looked to see that I broke one of the rules. So, okay, that doesn't look bad now. Okay, so these color generators are really good to generate sets of colors that go nicely together. All right, next time we will definitely talk about putting this in one file so that we can share it between multiple HTML files. And then we'll talk about some other things too. All right, see you over in lab.